This month, July of 2019, is the 50th anniversary of the moon landing. So let's talk about the best part of it. Let's talk about the history of food in space. Okay, pop quiz. Do you know what the very first food ever eaten on the moon was? Here's a hint. The moon landing took place on Sunday, July 20th, 1969. You know what it is? Don't worry, we'll get there in a minute. But first, let's go back to 1962 when John Glenn became the first American ever to eat in space. To kick things off, I went to the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum, partially because I spend all my free time in museums, but also because the Intrepid is a mecca for space fans. They've got an actual space shuttle, the Enterprise, plus a ton of history about the space program. In 1962, scientists didn't even know if humans would be able to swallow in space, let alone digest food. So, as part of the Mercury program, John Glenn was sent up to space with different tubes of pureed food just to test to see if swallowing would work at all. And if you do research about this part, you'll probably find lots of people saying that the first food eaten in space was applesauce. Or was it? This was the first food that John Glenn ate, but remember, the Americans were not the first people in space. The Russians got there first. Cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin actually ate the first meal in space. It was 2 tubes of meat paste, probably some sort of beef and liver paste combination, and 1 tube of chocolate sauce. This is a replica of one of the Mercury spacecraft. They're single-man pods that were designed for very short trips. And you may notice there's barely enough room for a person in there, let alone things like, I don't know, a bathroom. Before the astronauts were launched on the Mercury programs, they were specifically given low residual breakfast. Now that means it's a meal that was designed to be as absorbed by the body as completely as possible and leave as little as possible to be passed along. Basically meaning they were meals designed to keep the astronauts from having to poop in space. When you think of food in space, you probably think of 2 things: Tang and this stuff. These are the things that you buy in most museum gift shops. It's, of course, the freeze-dried fruit and the astronaut ice cream. And the freeze-dried fruit, yeah, okay, it's decently accurate, and as it says on the package, they have been enjoyed aboard spaceships. I don't know if they've necessarily been enjoyed, but they have been eaten on spaceships. The problem comes into play when you've got the ice cream. This never actually went into space. Everybody thinks that this is something that astronauts enjoyed on every single space mission, but while this was developed for space, none of the astronauts actually ate it up there. In fact, it even says so on the back of the package. It was invented for NASA's Mercury missions. It never actually claims to have been to space. They've interviewed several astronauts about it. They've confirmed they didn't eat this up there, and the mission records are completely devoid of any mention of this stuff. The only place that this has taken off was really in gift shops. If you've eaten these before, you know that one of the biggest things about them is that they're very dry. This is dehydrated ice cream, and unlike a lot of the dehydrated foods that they eat up in space, this does not have to be rehydrated. You don't have to add water back in it to eat it. But one of the biggest issues about it is that it's very crumbly. Every time you take a bite, it kind of falls apart a little bit. It's chalky, it's dry, and it causes a lot of crumbs. This is a major issue in space because any food that causes crumbs means that you can damage the equipment. Any of those crumbs can get caught in the vents, caught in any of the equipment that you're working with, even get caught in the breathing apparatus for some of the suits, which can later cause problems if you use those suits to go out on a spacewalk. So these foods, even things like bread, they're a surprisingly hazardous thing to eat, which is why this kind of stuff would have been banned on board. Now, the other one, the dried fruits, this is okay. This you can eat because this isn't really going to break apart. This is an actual slice of peach that's had all of the liquid removed from it, and this is why this kind of stuff was actually safe to eat. Through the mid-1960s, most of the food that was eaten aboard the space shuttles were in some sort of liquid form or paste form. That changed during the Gemini missions. In 1965, during Gemini 3, an astronaut named John Young snuck a sandwich that was corned beef on rye onto the space shuttle into space. The astronauts thought it was hilarious. They took a few bites, they joked about it, then they put it away because they knew the breadcrumbs would be dangerous. But the reaction shocked them. When they got back, they faced a ton of disciplinary action to the point that there was a congressional hearing over a sandwich. During the Gemini and Apollo missions, NASA moved away from the food in tubes and towards more dehydrated foods. This allowed them to greatly expand the menu and added things like apple juice, butterscotch pudding, kinds of toast squares that were coated in gelatin to prevent them from crumbing and flaking, and even shrimp cocktail. And if the words freeze-dried shrimp cocktail don't strike fear into your heart, I don't know what will. During the Apollo missions, each one of the meals were placed in special containers and sealed, labeled, and color-coded per astronaut per day, which meant that most of the time the astronauts didn't know what they were going to be eating until they opened up the package and saw what was inside it. But on Christmas Eve of 1968, they had a very nice surprise waiting for them. Thermo-stabilized turkey and gravy with cranberry sauce that didn't even need to be rehydrated. Isn't that such a treat? Now, the Apollo 8 mission is also where you see really great super 1960s foods like pineapple fruitcake. Which finally brings us 238,855 miles away to the moon. Ah, La Luna, the subject of a million paintings and photographs. My favorite, though, is this one, because it was taken by my dad! He's an astrophotographer, and his stuff is really cool. Now, time for the answer to that pop quiz. Did you figure it out? The very first meal ever eaten on the moon was pretty unusual. It consisted of bacon squares, dried peaches, sugar cookie cubes, orange grapefruit drink, and coffee. But while this was the first meal there, it wasn't actually the first food eaten there or the first drink. That title goes to Buzz Aldrin. After the shuttle had landed, but before the doors were open and the astronauts were allowed to go out to do the moonwalk, there was a scheduled period of downtime. During that downtime, Buzz Aldrin performed, believe it or not, Holy Communion. He poured some wine into a chalice that had been supplied by his church and ate one of the communion wafers and said a prayer. So technically, the very first food eaten on the moon is not bacon, it's a communion wafer. So what do you think is worse, freeze-dried shrimp cocktail or having to go to the bathroom in one of those tiny little capsules? Food for thought.